right, everyone. Today we're going to be doing notes 3.3, our last set of notes for Unit 3. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. Your essential question: how did FDR's New Deal bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression? And how is it still helping us today? So remember, in our last set of notes, we learned about the Great Depression. We learned about the stock market crash in October of 1929, Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. We also had other problems other than just the stock market. It wasn't just the stock market that caused the economic downturn. So we had agricultural overproduction. Remember, we had just got out of World War I, so we were producing more goods so we could send overseas. So that means we were really ramping up our farming, creating more production in the agricultural industry, and we didn't stop that after World War I ended. We also were producing too much in our factories and our industries. We had an unequal distribution of wealth. We had monopolies in this country. We had people making very, very good wages up at the top, and at the bottom, our lowest workers were making terrible wages. We started using credit, so loaning people money so they could be able to purchase things. And then, of course, the stock market being overvalued as well. But President Hoover, remember, believed in that trickle-down economics. He kept saying that things are going to get better, prosperity's just around the corner, but he ended up getting the blame for the Depression because he did too little and too late. So the government didn't really get involved. We had very limited government intervention. So we did end up having some loans to banks so that banks could reopen, but it wasn't really enough. Hoover thought that business should be self-regulating, so he believed in laissez-faire economics, which means government should not be involved in our economics. Government should stay out of business. He insisted on a balanced budget, and he wasn't a very good politician. He wasn't able to work well with other people to get this done. So we have this new politician coming up, President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He decided that he was going to run for office, but he also had an illness, so he was actually disabled. He started to become paralyzed when he was 39, so he slowly started losing the ability to walk. He did become the governor of the state of New York in 1928, and by 1932 he was running for the presidency. When he ran in 1932, he won a landslide victory. So FDR and the Democrats were able to win, and they promoted using the government as an agency for human welfare. They thought if people were struggling, it's the job of our government in the United States to help them out. And when I mean a landslide, this here shows you what a landslide is. Okay, so all of these states, except for the few red ones, it looks like we have about 5 red ones that did not vote for FDR. Everybody else voted for FDR. On March of 1933, the country was pretty much leaderless. The banking system had collapsed. Things were doing pretty terribly when FDR came into office. But in his inauguration speech, when he got sworn in as president, he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So he called for cooperation. He said that he had faith in democracy, and he believed that we could bounce back from the Great Depression. So 2 days after he took office as president, FDR actually closed all the banks in the entire country. He called it a bank holiday, and that was to stop the withdrawal of savings accounts. This was before ATMs, so even if the bank was closed, you couldn't have access to your money. Okay, so they stopped all withdrawal from savings accounts in order to protect the banks. He also passed the Emergency Banking Act to make sure that banks were being evaluated for their soundness to see if they could actually run their business properly. And this actually really helps. So the crisis was over. People had more faith in the financial system after this. FDR was a charismatic person. He was a warm person. He was a pretty good leader at the time. He had what he called fireside chats over the radio. So he used media. He was the first president to really use media. Back then, we didn't have TVs, but we did have radio. So people would listen to radio shows like podcasts. But back then, their whole family would gather around the radio and they would they would listen to radio programs. And so FDR used this new form of media to communicate with the American people. Once a week, he would have a fireside chat where he would have people listen to him, where he reported on the state of the country and how things were doing. He also reached out to experts so he could get help for new ideas on how to improve the country, how to pull us out of this depression. So he had what he called a brain trust. He had experts, college professors, people who had ideas on economics, how we should shape our government to make things better. He also had his presidential cabinet, and he had his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and she would travel around the nation and she would learn from how people were doing and she would report back to him. So the New Deal's purposes are these three R's. The New Deal is for relief, recovery, and reform. Relief is to provide jobs for people who are unemployed. Recovery is to get the economy back into gear, and reform is to prevent this from happening in the future. So their overall objective was to save our capitalist system. We had two New Deals. The first one only lasted a year, the first 100 days, actually, not even a full year. So the first New Deal was legislation to deal with a crisis. So they created all these new agencies to get people back to work to deal with the crisis that the country was going through. So we had things like the Public Works Administration and the Federal Security Act, Agricultural Adjustment Act to fix our overproduction of goods and to get people back to work. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 created what we call the FDIC. So whenever you go into a bank or a credit union, you should see a symbol that looks something like this that says FDIC on the door. That means that that bank or that credit union is protected by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. This provides the government insurance for depositors' savings. That means you never have to worry about losing your money again if a bank closes or if a bank collapses. So if you put your money in a bank, your money is protected up to $100,000. So if you have more than $100,000, you might not want to put all that in the bank. But if the bank does close, your money is protected up to $100,000. We had the National Recovery Act, the original NRA. They were focused on recovering industries. So they wanted to create partnerships with business and labor to set price controls, have wages increase for workers, and have fair competition. But unfortunately, this was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, so that one didn't really last. We had the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and this was to reduce production of the crops. We didn't need as many crops anymore because we weren't at war, we weren't sending them overseas. This was also unfortunately declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And we had the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This gave relief to individuals, so people who needed something right then and there. They could distribute money, clothing, food for people who were unemployed and who were struggling, who needed help. We also established the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This provided relief to young men. It gave them work. So it gave outdoor work to unemployed men. They were able to do things like build bridges, create roads, outside work, make parks. This was given to people who were ages 17 to 29. They received $30 per week, per month on their check, but 22 of that went back to their families. So they had to make sure that those young men were working to provide for their families. The Second New Deal lasted for 6 years from 1935 to 1941. This extended government oversight of the banking industry and raised taxes on the wealthy. So the richest people in society had to pay more taxes to help out everybody else. We also passed the National Labor Relations Act to make sure labor was protected. People had the right to unionize, things like that. And then we had the Social Security Act. The Works Progress Administration built roads, subways, airports, schools, hospitals, even zoos. They funded the efforts of artists and writers and actors. This was something that was the largest peacetime jobs program in US history. It employed over 8.5 million Americans, and this helped people be able to earn a paycheck. The Social Security Act that was passed in 1935 gave aid for dependent children, and it also established unemployment insurance and helped out with old age pension retirees. So, What this does, it provides money for parents who have children. We have that in terms of a tax credit now, so every child is worth $1,200 on their parents' taxes. We also have unemployment insurance, so if you were laid off from your job, we have millions of Americans on this right now because so many people have been laid off in these COVID times. This establishes money that is given directly to you from the government. It is something that you pay into every single month when you get your paychecks. And then we also have pensions for people to retire once they are over the age of 65. So that makes sure we can have older generations retiring so we have more jobs for younger people. So that hopefully would get older people to retire, to enjoy their retirement, to leave the workforce, and open up these jobs for younger people who need more work. So when you start working, this will be taken out of your paycheck every time you work. So you will have a Social Security tax that you pay every single time. And then when you retire, you'll be able to collect some of this money. So once you retire, you'll get a check every single month that helps to pay your bills. And that's the end of your notes for today. So don't forget to write a summary